HighBridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Great River, The Making and Unmaking of the Mississippi, by Boyce Upholt, read by Gabriel Vaughan. It is the great circulation of the earth's body, like the blood of the gods, this river in which the past is always flowing. Every water is the same water coming round. Every day someone is standing on the edge of this river, staring into time, whispering mistakenly, only here, only now. Lucille Clifton, The Mississippi River Empties into the Gulf. Introduction. A most magnificent spectacle. The tangle of water that we know as the Mississippi River has borne many names through the years. The Dakota called it Hahawakpa, the River of the Falls, because in the heart of their territory the water plunged over a ledge of limestone, dropping 20 feet, coiling into spires of mist. Several names once used across the South live on now in the notes of early European explorers, who did their best to transcribe what they heard. Chukagua, Tamalisu, Tapatu, Malbanchaya. These men also conjured their own name, El Rio del Espíritu Santo, the River of the Holy Spirit. The French came next, wandering into the watershed from the Great Lakes, and tried out several options. The St. Louis River, the River Colbert, before they found one that stuck. Mississippi was a word they borrowed from the Ojibwe people, whom they had met in the North Country. The French wound up being the first Europeans to traverse the river's full length, and as they traveled downstream, Catholic priests and backwoods fur traders carried this northern name with them, forging a lasting idea. There are varied ways to translate Mississippi. Big River, say, or Long River. I prefer Great River, if only because it reflects the facts on the ground. The Mississippi River drains more than 1 million square miles, an expanse that encompasses 40% of the continental United States. All 7 states, parts of another 25, and a small scratch of 2 Canadian provinces. More than 100,000 named waterways pour into this river, plus countless creeks too small to make the maps. Then there are our artificial channels, city storm drains and sewer lines, canals and ditches on the edges of farms. Half a continent of culverts and pipelines carefully constructed to send water on downstream so it becomes someone else's problem. All told, the Mississippi River spits 140 cubic miles of water into the Gulf of Mexico each year, enough to cover the state of Louisiana to a depth of nearly 14 feet. The line of water that runs south from Minnesota and bears the label Mississippi is just one of several significant contributors. Other tributaries can claim grander superlatives. The Missouri traces a route nearly twice as long into St. Louis, the point where the 2 rivers meet. The Ohio River, which joins the party another 200 miles downstream, is shorter but mightier. Where its waters enter, at the bottom tip of Illinois, the combined rivers double in flow. Here begins the river I know best. The lower Mississippi, as geologists call it, is distinct from its tributaries in nearly every way, even in psychic heft. I've heard stories of through paddlers who, after traveling more than 1,000 miles from Minnesota, give up when they reach Cairo, the soggy town built atop a spit of land between the Ohio and the Mississippi. They're overwhelmed by the size of these conjoined waters. Even when the river sticks within its banks, the channel here stretches a mile across. When you sit upon the lower Mississippi's surface in a canoe, you realize this river has its own topography. Crests and valleys, feet high, curls and curves and whorls, wide, still boils. The long light at sunset and sunrise reveals a labyrinth of ripples. On some mornings, the water lifts into mist so thick you realize there's no end to the air and no beginning to the water. so your boat floats upon and within the river at once. Nor does this river have any real bottom. When the engineer and inventor James Buchanan Eads sank himself into the Mississippi near Cairo to salvage lost cargo, his feet never found solid purchase. There was just a rushing current of increasingly dense mud. Eads' rival, Andrew Humphreys, conducted the U.S. Army's first comprehensive study of the river and noted eddies that spanned half its width and surged upstream at 7 miles an hour. Humphreys declared the river a turbid and boiling torrent, immense in volume and force. A few sentences later he added, rather hopefully, that all this water was governed by laws. The first written records of the Mississippi River come from the men who accompanied Hernando de Soto, a Spanish conquistador, in his 16th century ramble across the continent. They were searching for gold, which they never found. Instead, their journey turned into a death march. The Europeans delivered death to the indigenous towns they found, and the Europeans suffered death too. Soto himself succumbed to a fever, and his soldiers dropped his body into the river in 1542. The next winter, the expedition's surviving members holed up in a village they'd previously ransacked. For months, they watched the river's water rise, expanding across the floodplain, until the pool spanned more than 60 miles. It was a most magnificent spectacle to behold, a historian wrote a few decades later, based on his interviews with the soldiers. For as far as they could see, nothing was visible except the pine needles and branches of the highest trees. Back then, more than 15,000 square miles went underwater in the big flood years, when the upstream rivers flushed the snowmelt and spring rains downstream. Such is the expanse of the Mississippi's southern floodplain, the low-lying land that is subject to the river's caprice. The story of a river is always also the story of its floodplain, or at least it should be. That's because the two are connected, or they should be. Floods once linked the river to backwater lakes, providing fish with quiet corners to lay their eggs. Floods delivered layers of rich soil that made it easy for the river's first inhabitants to harvest marsh elder and chenopod and knotweed and maygrass, ancient crops that now grow only in feral form, and later squash and beans and corn. When Soto arrived, wetlands covered at least 24 million acres along the southern river. Combined with the adjacent Gulf marshes, this was among the world's largest expanse of swamp, critical to the biodiversity of the entire continent. These swamps were critical to the continent's human cultures, too. Soto's men rambled from Florida to the Carolinas to Texas. Nowhere did they find so much wealth and power as along the lower river. The chief of each village lived inside a home atop a carefully engineered mound, a form of spiritual architecture that was born in the river's swamps 5,000 years earlier. The first of these earthworks appeared in Louisiana, where people gathered together to build complexes of rings and ridges and mounds. The size of the monuments grew through the millennia, and by 1100, 500 years before Soto arrived, the river swamps in Illinois featured a sprawling city with 120 pyramids, the tallest rising 100 feet above the surrounding creeks and bayous and sloughs. Long before any European king could even dream of this watershed, it already had its first superpower. We tend to think of the embryonic United States of America as consisting of 13 coastal colonies. But the country, the river's modern superpower, was dragged into being in large part by men who scrambled over the Appalachian peaks and followed the creeks they found on the far side. The British king had forbidden Western settlement, but these men were drawn to the Mississippi, determined to seize land and therefore wealth, so determined that they went to war, launching a revolution that birthed a new nation. After the Revolutionary War, the Mississippi watershed became white America's first frontier, a Wild West before anyone dreamed of deserts or rocky mountains. The men of the Mississippi Valley compelled the men of the East to think in American terms instead of European. The historian Frederick Jackson Turner wrote in his seminal book, The Frontier in American History. They dragged a reluctant nation on in a new course. But while the expanse of the watershed, and the rich soils of the floodplain especially, lured land-hungry settlers, the river itself inspired more caution. William Alexander Percy, an early 20th century poet who made his living overseeing his family's massive plantation, called it the shifting, unappeasable god of the country. The Mississippi was the undeniable life force of the Cotton Kingdom, the builder and underwriter that had delivered the soils that made Percy's riches possible. It was also the menacing force that could wipe his property away. For centuries, engineers worked to tame this god. The first levee along the river was completed in 1720 in New Orleans, or the Ile d'Orléans, as its founders sometimes called it, the island of Orleans, because it was surrounded by so much water. It was a simple technology, a waist-high wall built from boards and tree trunks, buttressed from the back by a mound of soil. As the levee grew beyond the city, this fortification turned even simpler. No wood at all, just a pile of dirt. A century later, once the Americans claimed the river, the project of conquest grew more technological and more violent. Crews packed dynamite into the river's rocky reefs, blowing open navigable channels. They dispatched steam-powered battleships to smash through sunken trees. Later, hydrologists assembled concrete models, including one as big as a small village, so as to comprehend the river's misbehaviors. Through it all, various camps of engineers squabbled about science and theory and who should be in charge. The winner of that fight was a bureaucratic behemoth suited to the might of this watershed. The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers once dug a tunnel in Alaska to study the effects of excavating through permafrost. The agency built a city in Saudi Arabia to house that country's troops. But the Mississippi watershed is its masterwork. The Corps has built dozens of locks along the upper Mississippi and the Ohio, rendering both into watery staircases so that towboats can cart the nation's grain and coal. The Missouri features 6 massive dams that together create the largest water storage system in the country. But it's on the lower Mississippi, the unruliest of the nation's rivers, where the Corps' ambitions reached their peak. The Mississippi River and Tributaries Project, as the system of infrastructure is officially known, is arguably the most successful civil works project ever initiated by Congress, according to the Corps. There are no dams on the Southern River. There is too much water for dams to be necessary. But hundreds of rock dikes direct the flow of the water, and thousands of miles of concrete padding along the banks prevent erosion. 14 engineered shortcuts are meant to speed the water along and thereby decrease floods. 4 different floodways offer release valves for when the water rises too high. The crowning feature of the MR&T project is the modern levee, which now snakes along the southernmost 1,000 miles of the Mississippi, opening in only a small handful of places to allow smaller rivers to offer their tribute. The world's longest levee stretches along the river's west bank, from the mouth of the Arkansas River to the headwaters of the Atchafalaya, an unbroken wall of earth that spans 380 miles. The only longer human-made landform on the planet is China's Great Wall. Levees have yielded a kind of landscape new upon the earth, a dried-out floodplain. It's possible now to walk just a stone's throw from the continent's largest river and have no idea that you're near water at all. You stand instead in a neat and tranquil neighborhood, or amid a dusty field of soybeans, protected by the quiet green slope of the wall, which stands 40 feet tall or more. I grew up far from the river, amid a sprawl of suburbs in Connecticut, a place where the word Mississippi was just a four-syllable approximation of the length of 1 second, convenient for counting time in a game of tag. Even after footloose happenstance delivered me into the walled territory along the river, I took a job in rural Mississippi working in struggling schools and began to eke out a life as a writer on the side. I paid little attention to the nation's big river. Its waters were irrelevant because they were invisible, hidden behind the wall. Then I took on a magazine assignment to write a profile of a man named John Rusky. Like me, Rusky had wandered into Mississippi from far afield, Colorado in his case, lured by the chance to learn blues guitar at the feet of the masters. Eventually, Rusky took an office job in a small-town museum to pay the bills. A child of the mountains, he found the hours trapped behind a desk were rather claustrophobic. For relief, he went out to the river, exploring its islands and back channels by canoe. By the mid-1990s, he was well known as a riverman, so when a Belgian tourist asked how to see the Mississippi, someone suggested he hire Rusky for a tour. 2 years later, Rusky founded the Quapaw Canoe Company, the first guided service anywhere on the lower river. By the time I met him in 2015, Rusky had been working for years on a mile-by-mile guide called River Gator. Intrigued by the project, I talked my way onto the crew for Rusky's final reconnaissance expedition. We were a group of 8, of whom I had the least experience on a big river. None at all. The morning we launched, the Mississippi was so high that it had swallowed the road to the boat ramp. But someone had dug a ditch alongside a farm road, which, thanks to the flood, had become a tiny tendril of the country's great river system, a canal that led out onto the flat sheet of water spread atop the field. After a mile, this pool merged into a sluggish little river known as the Buffalo, which after another 2 miles joined the mighty Mississippi. The surface of the ditch was scummy and green, laden with whatever chemicals had run off the surrounding farm fields and cattle pastures. A snake shimmied across its top. Rusky grinned. Then he jumped in, his ritual river baptism. On the big river, the flood left no landscape, just the tips of barren willow branches reaching up from brown water. Trash studded the few visible lines of riverbank, washed-up buoys, bottles and cans, food wrappers. Once, even an overturned refrigerator. A few times an hour, a towboat gnashed through the pool, carrying its loads of commerce. 30 barges or more packed with grain or chemicals or scrap metal assembled together in a long, thin line, as much as 5 acres in total, as big as a small floating farm. After each boat passed, the water remembered its presence, its surface convulsing with waves. Mark Twain once called this a river of desolation, and to me, on that afternoon, his description seemed apt. But as we paddled toward the island that would serve as our first campsite, a warm breeze greeted us. We arrived on a strip of sand that rose until it met a wall of willow trees. Our party spread across the dunes. I pitched my tent at the edge of the forest, from which tracks, coyotes, beaver, deer, emerged. To the east, I could see the glow of lights from the Louisiana State Penitentiary, the country's largest maximum security prison. To the west, I could hear pickup trucks roaring on a country highway across the water, beyond the levee, in the version of the floodplain that I knew. It was green, yes, but all straight lines and hard edges, an entirely human domain. On that island, meanwhile, sheltered under the vast sky and its stars, hemmed in by the water and the woods, listening to the lapping river, drifting in and out of sleep, I felt like I was in a separate world. This place was windswept and water-blasted, composed of curling lines. It was not a typical wilderness, perhaps, but it was as wild a place as I had ever been. The French had a special name for the land between the levees, a word that's still used today in the South, batture, which comes from battre, to hit, to beat, to batter. The word's French roots are somewhat obscured by its pronunciation, which, like many imported words, has been adapted to the southern accent. Batcher, you'll usually hear. It's a name that makes sense, because these are flood-battered lands. The batture is a place that tends to defeat any human aspirations. Build a cabin there or plant a farm, then wait a decade. All evidence of your presence will be washed away. Indeed, because the Mississippi is always shifting, the land you once stood upon might be gone, swallowed by the river. That first trip on the river sparked an obsession, first with the batture, then with the whole of the watershed. In the decades since, I've assembled a miniature library of books on the histories of the river's great cities, on its indigenous customs and lifeways, on the travails of the first European explorers to encounter these waters. I've got memoirs of young hippies who ran away from society to live in the swamps, and scholarly studies of the squatters who occupied the shanty boats tied to its banks. I've logged more hours in archives than I care to count, thumbing through the crumbling pages of out-of-print travelogues. Twain once said that the Mississippi is well worth reading about, and he is right. But my time in those carols always reminds me it's well worth seeing, too, which is why I've spent hundreds of days, thousands of hours paddling the river, sleeping on its banks through snowfall and blazing heat and thunderstorms strong enough to blow down trees. I've found a lot of beauty out there. I've also found reasons to worry. When I skimmed across a frigid lake in a john boat with a fisherman, the only river fisherman I could find still working in the state of Mississippi, he hauled up nets full of undersized buffalo fish. They were being starved out, he told me, by invasive Asian carp. When I toured the marshes along the river's coastal edge, which supply 1 billion pounds or more of seafood in some years, nearly a third of the landings in the continental United States, my guide pointed out the pilings at the site of former fishing camps. They'd been abandoned and demolished because the marsh itself was disappearing. Every day, on average, 800,000 square feet of these wetlands dissolve into the ocean. Pipelines and dredge boats carry mud to the edges of the Louisiana coastline, constantly rebuilding the buffer of wetlands that protect inland towns and cities against storms. On one early trip, I traversed an old oxbow lake with a biologist who was sampling its water for microscopic life. He told me that because our modern engineering has locked the river in place, new backwaters are no longer forming. The old backwaters, meanwhile, are filling, as they naturally do, thanks to the endless tide of mud. No one knows what will happen as these slow back channels, the spawning grounds for so many species, disappear. The dry side of the levee has not fared much better. Drained and cleared, the river's swamps have become an incredibly productive swath of farmland, but also a landscape denuded. Most of the local species have been extirpated, often intentionally. Those that we want, soybeans and corn and cotton and rice, are kept alive only thanks to pumps and chemicals and genetic engineering. Nor has this regime produced an economic windfall. Nearly every county along the lower Mississippi River is marked by stark rates of poverty. The river, meanwhile, remembers its old ways and keeps on reaching outward, flooding its former domain. In an 8-year period early this millennium, the river hit its 10-year flood stage 7 times in Mark Twain's hometown of Hannibal, Missouri. Run 1 million simulations, and such a sequence should only happen once. But this is not random. The river we've built is coming apart. Back in the 1940s, as the Corps of Engineers was entering its greatest bout of river-building mania, the Argentine writer Jorge Luis Borges published an enduring fable, the story of an empire whose cartographers grew too detailed. Their map of a province would be big enough to cover an entire city, the map of the country unfurled across a province. Eventually, these cartographers produced a map so large that it covered the whole of the empire it was supposed to depict. Future generations, for obvious reasons, decided that this document was worthless, so they let it rot away until just a few tattered bits remained in the desert, where animals and beggars lived atop the scraps. As I've studied the Mississippi, I've come to think of the modern river as something like this map. It's an imagined canvas that we've stretched atop the geological frame of the continent. The names we use are temporary, labels we've adopted just for this moment. This is not to say the locks and levees aren't real, or that they have no consequences. It's more that, like a map, they aim to freeze an ever-changing river in place. Like a map, the concrete and steel will wither with time, and beneath the infrastructure, another Mississippi River persists. The Great River is a tale of both rivers, of the map and of the territory, of a river that has been the victim of some of the world's most intense and elaborate engineering, and of a river that is as wild a place as you can find on earth. I have aimed in this book to be as rigorous as any scholar, but I am not a historian, and this book is not a standard history. To peel through the layers of the river, I found that at times I've had to abandon the comforts of chronology, though this, I think, makes for a story truer to the river itself. The Mississippi never sticks to its banks. It is always winding, finding new routes. I hope that as I have wound, I have carved out paths that both surprise and reveal. I hope, too, that you will see the beauty that persists despite our mistakes. And I hope, most of all, that you will be tempted to come and join me on the rivers across the great and sprawling watershed. Your presence, all of ours, is what the Mississippi most needs. Part 1. Alluvial Chronicles. Time immemorial to 1803. 1. Searching for a river. White explorers confront a watery torrent. In 1803, when Thomas Jefferson purchased the territory of Louisiana, what he really acquired was a watershed, nearly all the land that drained into the Mississippi River, or at least all the land that the United States had not already claimed. But what was out there? Jefferson's library included more than a dozen first-hand accounts of the river basin, the journals of French explorers, the notes of British surveyors. Yet even he had little clarity. The best maps of the era showed mostly empty space. It was all just wild land, as one newspaper editor complained. So Jefferson organized a series of expeditions. The most famous launched from a riverbank just north of St. Louis in 1804. As Meriwether Lewis and William Clark poled up the Missouri River with a fleet of keelboats, they became the first white settlers to document the grizzly bear and the black-tailed prairie dog and the pronghorn. They smoked tobacco with Lakota men amid the vast, unfurling prairies. They paddled into a dark canyon in the Rocky Mountains and eventually left the Mississippi's watershed behind. Zebulon Pike trekked north in 1805 onto the upper Mississippi, where he was forced to drag sleds atop an iced-over channel. After he was assisted by the British fur traders who had already come to know the land, he shot down the Union Jack flag at one of their forts. This rude act was ceremonial. One of his missions was to assert his nation's ownership of this territory. It's safe to assume that as soon as Pike left, the old flag was restored. His second mission, to find the Mississippi's headwaters, wound up a failure too. Pike turned around 75 miles short of the lake that today is considered the river's official source. Soon thereafter, Pike received orders to mount a second expedition, an overland voyage to find the headwaters of both the Red and the Arkansas rivers. This was the most mysterious land in the Mississippi watershed, inhabited, according to some stories, by unicorns and giant serpents. Eventually, in Colorado, pike trudged through waist-deep snow.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?